everyone. Welcome to this Politico event on corporate social responsibility and which framework to choose for the EU. We have a great speakers lineup for you today and an interview with Commissioner for Justice Didier Reynders, who is responsible for this proposal. But before we get started, as this is an online event, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so you can all participate. Our speakers on the screen. Please don't be shy. Interrupt each other. You can raise your hand if you want to jump on each other's remarks. And our viewers online, you can ask questions. You can do so if you're watching us through our website. Then inside the website, there's a little window where you can submit questions. If you're watching us on Twitter or Facebook, then you have to open a separate window, go to sly.do, and using the hashtag CSR supply chains, you can submit questions, and this hashtag makes sure that the questions actually arrive here. There's already a poll that you can start answering to test this tool, and it's which way should the EU tackle human rights abuses? There will be 4 options for you to answer. Now, before we get started with the interview with Commissioner Reynders, here's a word from our sponsor, Bayer, who made this event possible. I'd like to welcome the CEO of Bayer, Werner Baumann.
Yes, good morning, Jakob. Good morning to the auditorium. Good morning, Commissioner Reynders. First of all, thanks for organizing this very important event, and also thanks for having us, Bayer, as a sponsor. I'll keep my remarks brief, but to me it's a personal, a very important topic that we are touching on, and that is corporate responsibility, and in particular, human rights. I think the situation that we face call even more decisive action as crisis in the world will put actually a lot of people into the hands of, let's say, forces that do not necessarily put human rights in the first place. And that's why it's so important for us as a company, but I also think important for governments, the European Commission, of course, and society at large. Having said that, this is also a very complex matter where we, as one of the stakeholders, would like to contribute because it is very complex and we need the right regulatory framework in order to be able actually to live up to our responsibility. In that context, I would like to highlight 2 very important topics. One is, ideally, we find a broad and ideally multilateral solution for that corporate responsibility area of human rights. And secondly, we need a solution that really brings clarity relative to our legal obligations as company. And in that context, what we can certainly do, what we see, what we influence, where we have direct interactions, is our direct area of influence, which typically translates into the so-called tier 1 suppliers of companies. Large companies can, of course, do quite a lot. Smaller and medium-sized companies have to be protected by, let's say, a framework that really enables them to adhere. And last but not least, as I already mentioned, the second topic, that we don't make it too broad, but really focus on the subject matter at hand, and that is human rights in the first place, rather than fiddling out and putting an awful lot of other things in. So we at Bayer stand here to support policymakers. We are ready to engage with NGOs, also with other companies, to contribute to those objectives. And as a good corporate citizen, as a global business, as a company that has strong values and ethics and has already a significant framework that we have on our own, but also within the industries that we operate, I think we have a lot to offer. So I can only call on you to call on us. And with that, I want to conclude my brief remarks and hand it back to Jakob. And I'm very much looking forward to listening in. Thank you.
Thanks, Werner. So the crisis making countries stronger, that don't necessarily care so much about human rights. I'm also going to talk about this with Commissioner Didier Reynders, who's a Commissioner for Justice and responsible for this legal proposal that will be, if all goes well, launched next year. The Commission actually published its first consultation on this yesterday, Commissioner. We will speak about that as well. But without wanting to take away the answers to these consultation, of course, I would like to also hear a bit more about what your preferences are regarding this law, how you want to actually get companies to clean up their supply chains, care more about human rights, how you want to make this fair between big and small companies, and how you want to enforce this. Maybe to start, I just want to ask you an almost more philosophical question. It's the hen and egg problem that's always been around the ethics of how businesses deal. Who do you think is actually responsible for making sure that human rights abuses don't happen in supply chain? Is this ultimately the consumer? Is this the company, or should it be the governments? And maybe that will already help us.
Good morning. First of all, I'm sure that we are sharing the same goals, so to have a better situation about human rights and social conditions, but also the evolution about the climate. And we have decided at the European level to be neutral in 2050 about the climate. So it's very important to say that it's a common objective from the different actors. And so we need to act together. It's not just the responsibility of the authorities or the companies or the consumers. We need to take all the different actors on board. And there is a real accountability of the companies to take part in the process. And I want to say that with the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen, and we are looking at already now in the second wave of the crisis, that we need to have a better resilience of all the different parts of the society. Some companies, we have seen huge problems in the supply chain, but also, to take an example, the healthcare system. We need to have a better sustainability and a better vision of medium and long term about our healthcare system, because we have seen different problems of resilience in the healthcare system. So to answer your question, it's a responsibility for the different actors, for the different stakeholders, and not just the public authorities or the companies, but for all. And the citizens are also involved in the process.
Okay, if you want the citizens to be involved also, of course, the citizens need information to actually know if they're buying clothes, whether they're buying clothes from a company that knows where its suppliers are and how they treat their workers or not. And currently, it's hard or almost impossible to tell this. There are some think tanks, but that try to make these studies, NGOs. But of course, there's no label or transparency requirement. Is this something that you're looking into?
Yes, we are looking for some transparency rules, but the citizens, of course, are also consumers, so we will work on the involvement of the consumers in such a process. I will come in November with a new consumer agenda, and of course, it's to take the consumers on board of the digital transition, but also the green transition, the Green Deal. So you're right, we need to give more information to the consumers about the possible sustainability of the different products that they are seeing on the market, and so we will work on it. But also they are involved in the process about the so-called sustainable corporate governance. So to have the citizens on board as workers, as citizens, as consumers, we need to give them more information also. And so it's the reason why we will ask to publish informations about the due diligence in the supply chain. We will ask also to director the board of the companies to publish a more long-term strategy. It's one of the goals of this initiative that we are discussing now, is to have a real obligation for the board of the companies, for the directors, to have a long-term strategy, a long-term vision of the interest of the company, and so to take care of the possible impacts of their operations, of course, in the company, but also in the supply chain. And you're right, we need to ask to publish information on this, to have a real accountability to the citizens, but maybe also to have a civil liability and to have a capacity for some supervisory authorities to do their job.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the consumer choice is only one of the levers which you want to make possible through more transparency. What are the other levers? So what will in your mind be the basic obligation on companies under this new law?
But the first element is that we want to come with an horizontal approach. So we want to have obligations for all the different sectors and all the different companies in all the member states of the European Union. I'm saying that because, of course, it's possible to go further for some sectors in a second phase. I know that there are many discussions in the textile sector or about the minerals and other kind of products, but we try to work with an horizontal approach for all the companies. Of course, we'll take care of the SMEs because we are knowing that it's impossible to ask the same requirement from the SMEs that for very large companies. But as a first element, an horizontal approach for all the societies, all the companies with a limited liability in the company law. Then we want to work, I said, in all the member states because we are knowing that there are different kind of initiatives in the legislation in some member states. There is a law in France, but there are some discussions in Germany. There are discussions in the Netherlands, in other member states. We want to come with a level playing field at the European level. It's very important to do that, so to work for all the companies and in the entire European Union. If I may add, we will try also to see how it's possible to have a level playing field with the companies coming from the third countries, to ask to apply the same rules when a company wants to work on the internal market, like we are doing, to give an example about the protection of personal data. You know that we have the GDPR at the EU level, but of course we ask to the companies coming from abroad to fulfill all the provisions for the GDPR in the functioning of the company on the European territory. So we have such a kind of a discussion now to see what is the level playing field for all the companies in the entire European Union, and also if it's possible with third countries. And about the obligations, the first obligation is, I said, to have a real strategy on the long term. If we are looking to the last decades, and we have published a study about that, we have seen that there were too much short-termism in the strategy of the companies, with a real attention given to the shareholder and to the payback to the shareholder on short term, but not so much an interest to all the stakeholders, the workers, but also the local communities in the supply chain, sometimes very far from the company in the world. And we will ask to publish a real strategy on the long-term vision with an analysis on the impact and the risk of the operation, and certainly the impact on the environment, because we have taken a decision to be, I said, neutral, climate neutral in 2050. So it's a real part of the job to take the companies on board of that. And if they are doing the job with such a vision and the strategy, they need also, is the second part of the initiative, to organize a due diligence on the supply chain. Right. I've heard that, of course, it's easier about the tier one, about the first suppliers, but with the mandatory initiative that we are organizing, it will be also a tool for the companies to put a pressure on the tier one to do the same with their tier one suppliers. So again, there are two parts: the director duties, a long-term strategy, and the due diligence on the supply chain.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of elements here on the scope and on how to apply this to big, small companies, whether to apply this to companies outside of the EU. I want to ask you about this a bit later, but about the actual obligation that it introduces on companies. So you said there's an element of an incentive element, if I understand this correctly, for managers, and then there's an element that actually creates a new obligation, and you said to analyze the risk within the supply chains, the environmental and the social risks. So once a company has analyzed these risks yearly, I suppose, then is there also an obligation to act on these risks? And how do you check if a company has acted on these risks?
First, it's very important to have a transparency obligation. So, of course, if we want to know something, we need to ask to the board of the companies, to the directors, to organize a publication of their strategy based maybe on scientific analysis, because if we are speaking about environmental issues, there are a lot of possible research on this, and it's better to use the scientific research to publish some element of the risk and the impact of the operation of the company in the medium and long term. And so we will ask first the transparency, so to publish some kind of information, and then of course to take initiatives if it's possible to verify in the different elements of the supply chain, or it's possible to apply different kind of rules. Just to give an example, we have a lot of conventions from the ILO about the labor conditions, International Labour Organization. Of course, it's an obligation to apply that not only in the company, but also in all the different suppliers. And with the mandatory initiative that we are working on, it will be a real tool for the company to push pressure on the suppliers to apply the same rules. The same about the human rights. We have some standards, of course, not only at the EU level, also in the UN, and it's very important to us to take care of that. To give an example, there are in some sectors now different actions to fight against child labor, sometimes a sort of slavery of children in different sectors. And of course, we need to discuss that with the companies to see what is possible to do at the company level. But I've seen the question that you have put on the screen for the participants to the audience. And of course, I want to say that we need to work on both a mandatory initiative to put some obligations on the shoulders of the directors and the board of the companies, but also we need to discuss with the countries, because we need to take on board of the trade agreements the same concerns about environmental, social, and human rights issues, but we need also to take on board of our development policy. When we are working with Africa, to give an example, we have an African partnership. Of course, we need to come not only with rules, we need also to come with maybe some agreement like in trade, but also with development aid. And we need to support the process at the country level.
This is something that your colleague, Commissioner Dombrovskis, also said he wants to take on board more enforceable trade and sustainable development chapters, and Trade Committee Chair Bernd Lange from the European Parliament has been involved in this, who will speak later in the panel a lot. But to get back to the obligations on companies, the due diligence obligations, aren't you creating? I mean, if I'm a good manager, I will analyze the risks thoroughly, and I will then act on these risks. But isn't there an incentive if I'm less good manager or more, then I would just not list all these risks, because otherwise I would have an obligation to act on those?
No, the most important element is to show that you are doing the best efforts to not only to list the risks and the possible impact, but to react and to take some measures to prevent some risk. Because if you know that there are some risk, of course, it's possible to try to prevent that. And it's also possible to try to discuss with your suppliers and to put in the procurement, to give an example, some rules to have a real influence on the suppliers. Of course, it's impossible to have a real result in all the supply chain without any hesitation. Of course, it's more difficult. I've listened to the comments about the tier 4, tier 5, tier 6, than the tier 1. But you need to show that you have put into place a real framework to act, not only to list the risk and the impact, but to act. And then, of course, you need to show that you are doing the best efforts to have the best possible results. And then you will have a liability, of course, due to the publication of the list of impacts and risk and the possible efforts that you are doing. There's a possible liability if we are seeing that it's without real best efforts and without real action. But you said, is it possible to have an incentive? Why not? We have seen in the last decades, and I was in charge for the finance department in my home country during the bank crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. Sometimes we have seen a link between the remuneration of the directors in some boards and the immediate evolution in the stock exchange.
So this is the second element of your proposal.
Yes, but why not to make another link between the remuneration and a real medium and long-term vision, of course, with a positive evolution for the company, to give a better resilience to the companies. Because again, we are sure that we need to rebuild the business model in another way after the COVID-19 crisis than before, but also before the crisis. We were sure that it's very important to take the companies on board in a sustainable way, in a sustainable process. And that's the main goal of the initiative, in fact.
But isn't that, I mean, resilience, isn't that the company's own core responsibility? Basically, a company that's not resilient will go bankrupt, but that's how our system works, no?
Yes, it's true, but we have seen many companies doing their job on a voluntary basis. But now it's time to have a mandatory initiative to be sure that we are taking on board all the companies and not just some with a real willingness to do the job and to deliver. But if I want to answer to your question, we have seen the last decades, and it was shown by the study that we have published, that it was possible to pay more and more dividends to the shareholders and not so much to invest in research, development, and infrastructures. And we need to have another kind of evolution. Of course, we need to pay back the shareholder. It's not to say that we don't want to have dividend for the shareholder, but the proportion needs to be quite different. We need to go back to a more sustainable way with real investment in research, development, and infrastructure. And of course, we will see that in the result of the company, in the publication from the companies.
Just to be clear, this is the element on directors' duties that you're talking about, where you want to create incentives or remuneration linked to long-term duties of companies. Would that be a legal obligation, or would that be basically asking companies to do this? But it's definitely, in the end, it's their choice, because otherwise, aren't you creating a conflict of interest between a manager who gets his remuneration based on goals set by the EU and the actual owners of the company that maybe have different goals?
Yes, but it's the reason why we ask to the directors and the board, and not only the CEO, but the board of the company, to think about all the stakeholders, not only the shareholders, but all the stakeholders. So the workers, of course, and we have discussions with the trade unions about that, but also the people with maybe a real effect of the operation of the company in their local community. We have seen that in the past, some pollution coming from activities of one of another company, but also some real impact on social side, human rights, and maybe environment on local community in the supply chain. So it's very important to ask to the directors to take care of all the different stakeholders and not just the shareholder. Of course, the shareholders are a part of the stakeholders, but it's maybe a real change. And it's one of the questions that we are launching in the consultation. Of course, we want to see how it's possible maybe to have a liability, and why not to put some sanctions in the initiative if there are some problems with some companies, but also what kind of incentives. And for the shareholders, if the shareholders have also a long-term vision and not a short-term, just a short-term vision, if they have a medium and long-term vision, they have also an interest to see that for the board, for the CEO, it's very important to invest in research, development, and in the sustainability of the company. And that's the way that we want to change the course of many companies. But again, we have seen voluntary commitment taken by many companies. So I don't want to say that there's nothing, we don't start from scratch. But we try not to have a level playing field with all the companies on board.
To get back to the first element of the law, so not the incentives for directors' duties, but the actual liability on due diligence. We have a question from Slido by an anonymous person, but it's still a good question. Can a company be held liable even if the company or its supplier are compliant with the law of a third country?
Yes, it's possible to be liable, but liability go far. It's maybe more in contradiction with some regulation in some countries. Of course, if you have violation of human rights in one country and you are working there, of course, it's possible to be liable for such a violation of the human rights. It's not because one country in the world is organizing violations against the human rights or violation of social rules or implement policy against the vision that we have about the climate. that it's impossible to be liable. So of course you need to take care not only about the correct application of the legal situation in the country, but also about the principles that we are putting into place at the international level and at the EU level, of course.
ILO, I suppose.
Of course, if there are violations of
Yeah.
ILO convention in one country, it's not a good reason just to apply the legislation on such a country. You need to apply the ILO convention.
So ILO is one standard. Is there also another, so that's a social standard. Is there also a human rights standard for certain basic human rights?
Yes, of course, and we have seen that there are more and more evolutions in the UN discussion about that, and at the OECD also we have some developments about the possibility to take care of human rights in the way to organize the development of one company and the supply chain. And again, there's a link because
what would the exact
human rights issue are in line with labor conditions.
Right, sure. What would the standard be that the EU takes? Would it be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Or, I mean, how do you actually make sure that a supplier of a company is respecting human rights? What would that definition be?
But we will discuss again that in the preparation of the initiative with the consultation that we are launching. But of course, there are some standards, like you said, in Universal Declaration. We have some standard at the EU level, so about human rights, because you know that in the Article 2 of the treaty, we are speaking about fundamental rights, we are speaking about human rights, not only rule of law and democracy. And there also it's important to see how it's possible to uphold the standards in different parts of the world. And we are doing that maybe also with our companies, not only with the discussions between the authorities, but also with a real action coming from the company. So we will ask, of course, to the company to do more than just to apply the minimum standard.
Yeah. We have very little time left, but I have a question about the scope. Would this law also apply within the EU or only to suppliers outside of the EU? Because, I mean, we're talking about due diligence, but in your other job, you're also enforcing rule of law within the EU. Could this law have a link? For example, if a French company is importing something from certain regions in Poland that might not be respecting all basic human rights?
Of course, you know that we have published, I was leading the work on the first annual report on the rule of law, and we have published the first annual report at the end of September. And it's quite the same, if I may. We need to do the job at home if we try to become to be credible out of the European Union. So if you want to discuss with your neighbor country, you need to show that you are doing the job at home first. And of course, we have more capacities to act in the European Union than outside. So we need first to show that we are doing the job in the European Union to become to be credible in the actions that we try to organize out of the European Union. But again, if you take the actual initiative that we are preparing, we will work on the entire world. It will be the supply chain in Europe and abroad. And that's the goal that we have. We try to ask to the companies to be accountable about their actions, not only in Europe, but in the entire world.
Okay, so also within the EU.
Within the EU, of course, and within one member state also. Because you have some suppliers in your own country.
Yeah, that's true. One last question, because we're running out of time. What would the sanctions be? There's an idea from the European Parliament to include a sort of traffic light system, a bit like in the fisheries legislation on illegal fisheries, that basically you get a yellow card, and if a country really didn't respect and didn't engage, or a supplier, then you get a red card, and certain imports would actually be blocked or blacklisted. Is that
we are very open about the liability. First of all, it must be possible to have supervisory authorities to analyze the publications coming from all the companies and to see if they are really forced in the company to put into place a framework to organize the due diligence, to publish a long-term strategy. It's possible to give to the citizens and to organizations the right to act with a civil liability. Is it needed to go to the criminal liability, and with new regulation on this? It's open. And it's one of the questions that we have asked in the consultation that we have started yesterday. It's very important to see now what are the best instruments. Of course, the lesson learned from the French legislation or from other kind of discussions like in the fisheries, like you said. are
Yeah.
very useful. But for the moment, we don't want to say we'll work on one element. It's true that we need to have supervisory authorities, but we need also to have a civil liability. But we are open to receive some proposal and remarks, maybe from your panel that you will have just now, but also with all the participants, because again, I insist, if you are interested in our initiative, please take part in the consultation.
Great. This is all the time we have. Thanks very much, Commissioner Reinders, and I will now give. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Giorgio Leali, and who will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Jakob. I'm very happy to introduce the second part of our event, which will be a panel discussion with policymakers and voices from the civil society and the industry. But before introducing you to all of them, just a quick reminder about how you can participate to this event online. You can ask your question via Slido, and you can do it on Twitter via the hashtag CSR supply chains, which can be used for Twitter, but also directly on Slido if you're following the event on internet. Just below the live stream window, you can find a space where you can send your questions. Also, there is a poll which has been launched at the beginning of this event. It is about how the European Commission should tackle human rights abuses. You have some options which are a mandatory due diligence, a dialogue with country's authority, a blacklist or an import ban, or a mix of these three type of measures. And we will discuss at the end of the event the outcome of this poll. So now I'm very happy to present our guest. First, Bernd Lange, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Socialist and Democrats group. He chairs the Parliament Committee for Trade, and for that committee, he is the lawmaker in charge of this file of corporate responsibility, and he's working on a report which has been voted yesterday, so we will discuss about that with him. Then we have our voice from the industry, which is Laurent L'Hospitalier, who is in charge of corporate responsibility for the pharmaceutical group Sanofi. It would be interesting to understand what is the point of view of businesses with him. We also have a national policymaker from Sweden, Ulrika Lickman-Aldenred, who is Deputy Director for National Branding, Sustainable Business and Corporate Social Responsibility at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. And we have our voice from the civil society, Claudia Saller, who is Coordinator at the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. In addition, we have another guest, which will intervene later on in our debate, is Phil Bloomer, Executive Director at Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So we had very concrete information, I would say, from the interview with Commissioner Reinders. The consultation has been launched yesterday, but now we have more elements. Before starting our discussion, I would like to ask to each of you to please pick one element that you like the most in the proposal as outlined by Reinders, knowing that, of course, there will be a consultation, and one element that you don't like much, something that maybe is missing or something that you think you shouldn't be there. And I really ask you to answer to this question quite quickly, so maybe one sentence for what you liked and one sentence for what you didn't. I would start with Mr. Lange, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. And as we adopted yesterday a position to have a European approach, a horizontal approach for all sectors for the supply chain, I really support this position of Commissioner Reinders. He was not really clear about this, if it should be more going in a direction of a directive or on a regulation so that member states have more space. This would be not in my interest. I think we should have really a level playing field, which is concrete and binding for all companies without any loopholes based on the rights of member states.
Thank you very much. I will ask the same question to Laurent L'Hospitalier from the industry point of view. What was the best element and what you're less convinced about?
Well, I think it was very interesting that he mentioned really this idea of level playing field and having the opportunity for this legislation to also cover companies from third countries outside the EU, a bit like the GDPR has done. And I think that would be a very interesting way forward. Otherwise, maybe something that is more of a challenge for companies, and maybe I can elaborate on that later, is going beyond tier one, is going to be a real challenge. So what kind of legal obligations you put behind that is really key to better understand. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like now to know the opinion of Claudia Saller from the civil society. What is your point of view on this?
Thank you. Well, the element that I really like about Commissioner Render's proposal is that it contains civil liability, because civil liability will be the only form of sanctions that will actually allow for victims of negative impact of companies' operations to have access to justice and access to courts. And that's, for us, is the key, because it should be a legislation about protecting human rights and making sure that business does not harm human rights. What I'm not so convinced about is but I'm not sure if that is actually will be in the proposal, is the element of incentives for directors to do good, because that will take us back to a voluntary approach, or to a kind of it will take us away from the mandatory approach, and this is not a direction where we should go to. And also it may actually create a conflict of interest for directors, because the directors' duties are always owed to the company, and as long as the company is not under the obligation, the company as a legal entity as such is not under an obligation to protect human rights, directors can struggle as much as they want to take the good decisions, but they will always have to follow the company's legal obligations.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask the same question to Ulrika Lickman-Alnered. So one thing you liked and one that you didn't like so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say that welcomes the initiative and also the launched consultation, which is really important to include all the stakeholders' opinion on this. And that is on the EU level. Of course, we haven't seen it yet, so it's difficult to go into details. But what was not really clear and what must be avoided is an overlapping legislations between, for example, the non-financial reporting directive and others. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much. I think we have already a lot of elements on the table to discuss, which are the strengths and the weaknesses of this potential proposal. And now, I mean, all of you are involved in a certain way to this policy-making process, since the consultation is open. But the European Parliament already started working on this topic. So I would like to start with Mr. Langen and asking you, what are the key elements, the key proposal in the report that you voted yesterday? So what is your main message to the European Commission?
Yes, as I mentioned just before, we would like to see a European horizontal binding approach for all companies in the internal market. I think that's really crucial that we have here not any form of competition advantages being not covered by the legislation. Secondly, it should be really a risk-based legislation, so that companies have the obligation to analyze risk and make also risk management and a strategy, and have an independent monitoring system, and give also information to the public, so that we really avoid the situation of cut and go away. So there is a problem with human rights or labor rights, and then the company might decide to leave the country. That is not in the interest of the country, and of course not in the interest of the employees. So this has to be fixed as well. Then of course different size of companies, and especially small and medium-sized enterprises have to be quite clear in their obligations. So we need really to fix their concrete obligations. We have to give them a handbook, guidelines, and also specific information about specific risks in specific countries. Then we have some voluntary schemes from industry. They could and should be integrated in the system, in a certified way so that they are really on an equivalent levy. By the way, we have a kind of model for such a due diligence legislation in the conflict minerals regulation adopted by the European Parliament 3 years ago, where we indeed put in these elements I mentioned just before as well. So it's really a practical piece of legislation and not a bureaucratic monster. So everybody is aware about the obligation she and he has. That's, I think, really key and important. And from the trade part, of course, we want to have a close link to the existing trade instruments like bilateral trade agreements, like the GSP instrument, so that this will be, the due diligence obligation will be reflected in this legislation as well. And we should also look to get the monitoring system proper. In the conflict mineral regulation, we had also the clear perspective of an independent monitoring system, and this should be also applicable here in this legislation. And there, the EU delegations could also play an important role, and the business communities as well. And then, last not least, the question of risk management. I think important to find the proper way to avoid a violation of human rights, labor rights, environmental standards is in dialogue with civil society in the partner country, discussing where are the risks, what are the possibilities to avoid the risk and to overcome bad situations. So this is not only the decision at the green table in Europe, it has to be in concrete dialogue with the people on the ground so that we can find a proper way to avoid any violation in future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lange. Before turning to our other panelists, I would like to ask you a follow-up question about the discussions within the European Parliament. And what I would like to know, and I think would be interesting for European citizens, is which are the positions of different political groups. It looks like you have reached a consensus on this, but is it right to believe so that more centrist or center-right parties are more worried about excessive obligation on businesses, while the Greens are more focused on the sustainable side of all the initiative, and the socialists, as you, are more focused on the human right? Is that a simplistic view? Which are the different positions and maybe the elements of disagreement within the parliament?
As a social democrat, I'm looking, of course, firstly to the labor rights, no doubt about. And the ILO Convention, Commissioner Reinders mentioned, are crucial. The 8 core labor conventions should be respected and properly implemented. Of course, this is one of the crucial elements of due diligence obligations. But no, my really clear goal is to have a strong position of the European Parliament, a united position. Otherwise, we will have problems to get a proper legislation through. Once again, to the conflict minerals regulation, we discussed, I think, in the Parliament for around about 3 years to find a compromise between the different interests, the different political forces in the European Parliament. And then at the end of the day, we had a vote with more than 500 votes in favor in the Parliament and got a really good piece of legislation. And also yesterday in the International Trade Committee, we adopted 12 compromise amendments reflecting more or less the position I described just before, with the support of most of the political groups in the European Parliament. And this is, I think, really crucial. We want to have a clear European approach to base our trading policy on European values.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lange. So it looks like there is a unity in the European Parliament, or at least an attempt to be as united as possible. I wonder whether the same can be said for the industry, for the business world. That's why I would like to ask to Laurent Hospitalier, what are the main worries of the industry and the main recommendations, knowing, of course, that we refer to the industry, but we have very different type of companies. As the commissioner mentioned before, the approach for SMEs and for big companies is likely to be different. But do you think that due diligence is the right approach? Do you fear that there will be an excessive administrative burden?
Yes, so maybe, yes, I can give you some feedback. As a friend, we've had to enact on the French duty of law, which was enacted in March 2017. So it's now 3 years since the French companies are trying to implement this law. There are a number of very positive outcomes. Probably the first one is the integration, the formalization, and the professionalization of humans within the companies. So no longer so much a side top, but really something that is being slowly embedded in all the processes. Let me maybe give you an example. Because we're talking about supply chain, for instance, we've had supply chain audits for many years. I mean, before the regulations. But I would say before duty of vigilance, it was always a challenge to enact on the audit results. So there would be corrective action plans drawn up, but it was always a struggle to get the suppliers to go through these corrective action plans. Now we have a committee where we get our procurement people together and we explain the challenges we have on specific audit reports for specific suppliers. We outline the corrective action plans. So they are really supporting us now in actually getting the improvement going through, because I think due diligence is really a two-step exercise, and this needs to be understood. One is finding out, what are the challenges, what are the performance of your suppliers, which is already a huge challenge, and it indeed has to be risk-based because large companies have tens of thousands of suppliers. So we need, to work in a really focused way. But that's only the first step. Then the second step is when you know what the performance is like, then you actually have to somehow get the performance improvement, which is a separate challenge even for tier one suppliers. And this is where, for instance, industry initiatives that were mentioned by Mr. Lange are really important in putting the right level of leverage and pressure on the suppliers, and also giving them the right level of support and training that they may need. And for this, acting together as industry is very useful to get this forward. And there's also the issue of, if I want to tackle the issue of liability around this very example, Mr. also mentioned that the approach should not be to sort of pull out of countries where we know there are risks. I think the spirit of the French law was really to make improvements across the world and across the supply chain, very ambitious. And therefore, really sticking to the idea, okay, the option is not getting rid of bad suppliers. Well, sometimes you have to, but the idea is really improving those suppliers. There is going to be this period of time where basically they're not good, and there's only so much you can do about it, and you're going to set up some kind of improvement plan, and that may take a number of years. And during that same period of time, I think you're actually very vulnerable as a company in terms of liability, because that you're working with very poor suppliers, and
Sure.
you're trying to improve them, but you could be attacked on the fact that you're working with those suppliers. So I think somehow the liability must be balanced with a way of actually being able to show that we are doing our best efforts and to be recognized for that. So this is why I think it's also very interesting, and it's something that was lacking in the French duty of vigilance law, of having some kind of independent monitoring mechanism, some kind of agency at the European level who would be able to sort of give us advice on how we're doing, give us advice on the efforts that we need to go through, and also provide us with some guidance on what are the key risks, what are the key areas, because it's also a huge responsibility for companies to actually do all the job, working out what sectors are dangerous, what
Definitely,
countries we
yeah.
should not go into, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you mentioned all many elements that we will come back later on, so especially liability. And what I also would like to ask to Ulrika Lickmann-Alnered is, okay, we are now building probably a EU legislation, but we are not starting from scratches. We have some examples at the national level. As Laurent already mentioned, we have the French example. Why do you think that an EU-wide approach is needed? Why it is not enough to have domestic legislation to regulate this issue?
Thank you. Well, we don't have any national legislation, but we have a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights since 2015. We also made this follow-up report on the same, 2018. And last year, 2019, we also launched a platform on international sustainable business. This is to show the Swedish that we really put this issue in focus, sustainable business. I would say that it is really important to also work on these national action plans on business and human rights, both within the EU for the EU member states, but also, as we have been doing, supporting also third countries through the UNDP in launching national action plans outside of the EU. Creating, as has been said during the morning session, creating national legislation that might also create kind of a not a chaos, but it's more difficult for companies, especially those that are working internationally. And it would also create a level playing field, said by many speakers so far, to work on due diligence on the EU level. I would stop there. I would also like to add that, as also have been said, that the capacity building or training is really important for getting out both the theory and having a discussion on these issues. So what we did a couple of years ago, we created a CSR training on the internet, launched for our embassies. But we also shared this with the EU delegations. So it was launched by our Minister of International Trade last year. So there is a training module, both digging into the theory and into the dilemmas, discussing the dilemmas within the area of CSR. And I think this is really the starting point to reach out and increasing the level of knowledge within the area of CSR and including the human rights issue.
Thank you very much. And I would like now to maybe focus on the starting point of this legislative proposal, which is this report that has been published by the European Commission. And there are a few interesting information in it. I would say a lot of interesting elements to start this discussion. And one of these is that stakeholders are in general, they believe that national legislation on corporate due diligence are ineffective, sometimes inefficient, and in many cases they bring disadvantages for business. So I would like to ask you, Claudia Saller, why do you think that the same approach at a bigger scale, so at the EU scale, would be better? I mean, don't we risk having the same shortcomings that we have at the national level as it happened in France, for instance?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think so I'm not the spokesperson for businesses, obviously, but I can understand that for big business, it might be actually burdensome to work with this patchwork of sectoral and national pieces of legislation, and that's why we think it would be really advantageous for everyone involved, for businesses, for people who seek justice, for corporate abuses, for investors, to have some certainty on their sustainable investment policies, to have this kind of unified European approach that would apply to all companies doing business in Europe, and that would establish EU business as a leader in the sustainable, in a new sustainable way of doing business and getting away. Commissioner Reinders mentioned it, getting away from this short-term profit thinking. We really need to work on a sustainable economy, and we saw this more than ever during the COVID crisis that exposed incredible conditions in supply chains, incredible working conditions, and we saw companies just running away, not paying for goods that they had ordered and that had been produced in sourcing countries, and leaving the small suppliers and the workers with nothing, basically robbing them of their existence, because their short-term profit thinking was that, okay, we cannot sell these goods, so we also will not pay them. So this is not a responsible way of doing business. But I would like to get back to two starting points. One is the French law, indeed, which is a bit the model for the deliberations at the European level, for example. And there are already in the title, you find two very important elements in the law. It's called the law on the duty of vigilance. So on the one hand, it establishes this corporate duty. It's your duty as a company to make sure you're not harming people or the planet. It's a duty. And it's vigilance. So it's not a translation error. They called it vigilance for a reason, because it says actually more than just diligence. Due diligence is a management concept that has been companies have been working with due diligence concerning their internal operations for many years. But vigilance means more. Vigilance means we are alert. We are continuously monitoring the impacts we have. And I think that has to be a very important element. Another starting point, the Swedish representative already mentioned it before, the national action plans. They are very important. They go back to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that were adopted unanimously in 2011 already in the UN Human Rights Council. And they set out very clearly how to deal with business and human rights. They put the obligation in 3 pillars. So pillar 1 is the state's obligation to protect human rights. So they are very clear, and they are not to be mistaken with voluntary guidelines. The United Nations guiding principles are very clear, mandating states to go into regulation. It's not just voluntary, and we have seen, also the Commission has shown this in their own studies, that the voluntary approach is not enough. So we need states to regulate. The second pillar is companies need to respect human rights. And the third pillar is we need access for remedy. And based on this United Nations guiding principle for business and human rights, I think that's a very good starting point. And for me, this new proposal is one very important step to implement the UNGPs at European level.
Thank you very much. So you touched a fundamental aspect, which is the one of sanctions and liability. And Commissioner Reinders said that this will probably come in a second phase. The Commission is very open to different type of sanctions, but we had the impression that the approach is more focused on businesses, so incentives to directors, or maybe possibly fines for those who fail to report. But we don't have many elements about the compensation, what would happen to victims. So I would like to hear from each of you. Do you think that this system should include a civil liability mechanism that would then allow the victims of human rights violations to go, for example, to court and claim for monetary compensation? Or do you think that that would mean mixing 2 different things and we should just stick on reporting obligations? I would like to ask this question to all of you, and I would start with Ulrika, please.
Thank you. Well, it's a bit difficult to give an answer right now when we don't have any proposal, but I would just like to say that the issue of remedy and the UN guiding principle that was excellently presented just now is of course crucial and important for us. I would also like to mention that there is a function to ask for remedy through the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the national contact points, which are to work with this, where you could actually not give remedy, but you could file a complaint against violations on human rights.
Thank you very much. For now. Thank you very much. You've been very, very clear. And another aspect I would like to ask you about is the practical implementation of all this. So do you think, for example, that this idea of sustainability, how should it be defined? I mean, we had the impression from what the commissioner said that this initiative will be very much focused on sustainability. Even the title of the consultation is more about that. And do you think that maybe human rights are left a bit on the background, and so it's more focused on the green aspect of all this? Or do you expect the initiative to be very broad and to put everything together? I would ask this question to Mr. Lange, first of all. Don't you think that a too broad scope will risk undermining the mission of this tool?
Perhaps on the access to remedies, this is included in the position of the intercommittee. Clear, it's based on the UN guiding principle and the OECD guidelines. And we want to have access for victims also in Europe. So that's also sure that not in the partner countries. So that's one track. On the liability, we had further discussions. It's a quite complex system. So no, I don't think that the scope is really too big. We should, as Europeans, are really committed to European values. And of course, the European Union and the member states has ratified a lot of international conventions. This is more or less the universal law. Even it's not really a law, but it's clear that we should not have the possibility that European companies or importers to the European Union are able to undermine these international conventions. And therefore, I think it's now really the time to have a clear signal that we want to have a responsible business all over the world. And it's totally clear that we really depending on a globalized world, and we want to set a point as European Union, having in mind that this could be also be a starting point for other countries going in the same direction.
Yep.
We did it in some other elements as well.
Thank you very much. And now maybe one way of making our conversation more concrete is to take a concrete example. I have a question here from someone who is following us about the example of forced labor in the Xinjiang region in China. It's something that consumers know about. So I would like to understand, with a very strong due diligence legislation in place, could we, for example, avoid that products issued from forced labor in Xinjiang come to the European internal market? And to answer this question, I would like to invite our guest, Phil Bloomer, Executive Director of Business and Human Rights Resources Center. So I would like you to answer to this question, and then maybe I also ask a question to the other panelists if there is something that particularly surprised you in the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think these are really important questions. First of all, I'd say, regulation without sanctions are not regulations. And as people have said, we've got the United Nations guiding principles, we've got the OECD guidelines. Each of these has very clear definitions of due diligence and the way to go about it by each of the companies. I think in this case, what you can look at in terms of Xinjiang, you can talk specifically about what's happened with the US Tariff Act and its application. So, for instance, right now, the Customs and Border Patrol in the United States has impounded goods at port from Malaysian rubber glove manufacturers. Why? Because there is endemic forced labor through debt bondage in that particular supply chain. Despite the fact that they are producing rubber gloves, and many US health authorities and health companies are importing those goods. What's happened there? Well, quite simply, first of all, the company that's had its goods impounded at port, Top Glove, has immediately announced that it will pay $10 million back to the 10,000 workers who've been robbed of their wages through recruitment fees. And secondly, we've had a whole cluster of their equally reckless competitors immediately announce that they are also going to pay back those recruitment fees that were taken unfairly from those workers and put in order for them to get a job. So you can see immediately the way in which those sanctions operate down those supply chains. And in the same way, this legislation for human rights due diligence in Europe would have an equal effect, not just to those that are brought to court for this civil liability or criminal liability, whichever it ends up as, but it has immediately a demonstration and multiplier effect across all the reckless actors in any particular sector, whether it's extractives or digital, or whether it's apparel and footwear, as Claudia mentioned earlier.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much for your intervention. You also introduced one element that we haven't discussed yet, but it's very much interesting. And this element is another approach, the trade-based approach that we can find, for example, in the United States. So I would like to ask you, do you think that another approach based, for example, on a blacklist, as it happens in the United States, could be maybe a better one? Because on one side, it would allow political bodies to take the responsibility for their decisions. So it would maybe shield companies from retaliatory and retaliation behaviors. Do you think that that approach, the American one, would be maybe more effective and more concrete? Or do you think that due diligence, as outlined by Commissioner Reinders, should be the first step and then this could come after?
No, I think there are many weaknesses in the US approach, and the approach of the European Union is a far more subtle and effective approach to ensuring that companies begin to identify the human rights and environmental risks in their supply chains and develop, as Reinders said, a clear action plan to address it. If you look at the evidence that we have developed with a whole set of investors regarding company performance right now on human rights, the corporate human rights benchmark, which we've developed, demonstrates that half of all the largest companies in the sectors with the highest risk for human rights, half of them score 0 on every single human rights due diligence indicator. Half of them score 0. So they've not even begun to get off the blocks regarding identifying where there are risks in their operations and supply chains and what they will do to go about it. Now, be careful, because the scope here in terms of the scores is enormous. There are some really good companies who are doing a huge amount. We've heard from one of them today, who are doing a large amount to make sure that they're doing that. Why should those companies take that level of responsibility to ensure that they're not destroying people's lives through human rights abuse, destroying the environment through pollution, and be on a level playing field with competitors who show no regard for those, in fact, deliberately externalize their costs in terms of environmental and social costs through that pollution and through that human rights abuse. So the good companies of Europe have nothing to fear from this legislation. They will get a level playing field for the first time, ensuring that their irresponsible competitors have to behave at least moderately well. They'll get legal certainty, and they'll also get harmonization of the standards, because proliferation of different standards is a huge cost to companies and prevents their proper risk management.
Thank you very much, Phil, and goodbye, and thanks for joining our conversation. And you mentioned another issue, which is the one of liability. And we have an interesting question from Slido, from someone who is who is following us from home. And he's asking, can you please explain the difference between liability and remedy? It's a very concrete question, probably a legal one, but I think it's important for those who listen to us to understand which are the different degrees of remedies. So I would ask to Claudia, please, to maybe develop on this difference and explain why remedies are so important and should be part of the proposal.
Yeah. So the corporate liability, the liability is it means that the corporation is liable for what they're doing. So it's this concerns the corporation. The remedy should go to the victims, for example, in the form of compensation for the harm they suffered. And I will give an example how difficult it is for victims of negative impacts of companies' operations to get access to justice. So in 2012, we saw a textile company burning in Pakistan, killing more than 260 people. The families of these victims who died or even more who were severely injured, they are not legal experts. They don't know which law would apply. They just know that they suffered extreme injustice. They cannot afford a lawyer for that matter. And it takes a lot of time to figure all of that out. How do I get actually to justice? How can I be heard before which court, by the way, under which law? And this can take such a long time that by the time you arrive at a court, in this case, Pakistani victims' families arrived at a German court, and they came too late because and they were time barred. Had they come a year before, it would have been perfectly fine. The court would have accepted the case, but it was simply time barred. So it's very, very difficult for victims to access justice and to get to the courts of those countries that host the company headquarters where the harmful decisions are taken. And that would be very, very important. And that would be the avenue of civil liability. We also have administrative liability, which would tackle or which would challenge the company for not engaging in due diligence, for not having a proper due diligence process in place. We also have criminal liability that would target, for example, individual directors of companies. But you can get a director punished or in jail, but that will not help the victims. It will still leave the victims with the damage they suffered. So that's why all three elements are actually important, but for us, civil liability is the most important one.
Definitely. Thank you very much for making this point clear. And again, one other question of liability is maybe the scope of liability. The commissioner before mentioned the idea that to be realistic, we should just stick to tier 1 and then hope that this will put a pressure on other suppliers, and then that all the supply chain will be influenced by this new legislation. And I would like to hear from you. What do you think about this? Do you think that, on the contrary, liability should go also to tier 2, and so all along the supply chain? And I would like to ask this question first to Berlange and to see what is the approach of the European Parliament on this. Thank you.
So I would say due diligence for the supply chain. On the question access to remedies or liability, I think we have to discuss a little bit further, because it's quite a complex, also juridical issue, also between the European Union level and the member states level. But yes, we want to have due diligence in the supply chain. Of course, we have at the moment different opinions how far this due diligence should go and how far the scope should be. This is quite really linked to the question how to get information. And of course, it's not so easy if you have a lot of suppliers to get the information. But on the other side, with the digitalization, there are new possibilities. So, for example, there are some really impressive developments on the blockchain technology, so that you get really, even in a complex supply chain, all the relevant information you need. So this is one of the criteria, how far you can go in the scope. that you have really valid information. And the second criteria should be the question of monitoring, so that this has be also possible to have an independent monitoring system for that. And third criteria is, I think, the question of size of the company. And of course, not only regarding the question how many employees they have, because this is not really a criteria for importance and influence in partner countries.
Thank you very much. And I would like to hear the voice of the industry about one very precise point that is really important in this post-pandemic world, which is the question of resilience and strategic autonomy. Commissioner Reinders mentioned it. It is part of the description of the consultation, but maybe at a first sight it's not so evident why corporate responsibility should be related to resilience. Resilience is in the own interest of the company, while corporate responsibility is maybe a wider concept. And since now we have also a lot of debate about reshoring also the pharmaceutical production, I think that Laurent, you would be the best placed person to explain us why this proposal could also have an impact on the resilience of supply chains.
Yes, so I will, of course, focus on the pharmaceutical supply chains. As it has been mentioned during the crisis, pharmaceutical supply chains extend globally, and more specifically, we have now very large clusters in both India and China, which create, of course, specific issues in terms of due diligence. As an industry, we are working very closely with both our Indian and Chinese suppliers to make sure that they raise up their standards, and we are trying to do this very much through a collaborative industry initiative, which is called Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, put efforts in those two countries. More specifically, as Sanofi, we are lucky enough in terms of our strategy to have kept a lot of our production in-house as much as possible and across all continents, including Europe. In terms of resilience with regards to supply chain, what we discovered during this crisis is not only having two alternate suppliers, if I may say, because it's always a challenge in pharma. The more suppliers you have, they have to be registered in your dossier for the specific product. So each time you add an additional supplier which goes into your product, it's a huge regulatory process. But we realized during the crisis that it's not just about having two different suppliers, but it's also two different suppliers in two different geographies, because you need to make sure that the lockdown sequences, this is what we discovered. If you have two different suppliers, even in two different areas of India, you may be facing supply problems at the same time. So you need one supplier in India and one supplier somewhere else, totally, maybe Latin America or something. And this is the way, and of course, European suppliers as well. In terms of reshoring, I mean, more specifically to our company, as we have already kept a very strong industrial base, both in Europe. The issue is more around some specific materials that we're still using.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So yeah, it's also interesting to see how this specific policy fit into the particular, the peculiar historic moment we are living in. And maybe I think it's maybe time to have your reactions on the poll that we launched at the very beginning of our conversation. So we asked to our audience what they think would be the best approach to tackle human rights abuses. So we orientated our question to human rights abuses, but as we have seen with Commissioner Reinders, it is a broad question. It's also about sustainability. And we gave three proposals. One was mandatory due diligence, the one that we discussed so far. Another one is a more diplomatic way, a dialogue with third countries' authority, and that idea that was evoked before about this traffic light scheme, so a system of warnings. And then a blacklist of import ban, so an approach which is more focused on trade and which is closer to what happens in the United States. And you maybe already have the outcome of the poll, but you can imagine that a mix of the three measures is the preferred option. 42% of respondents voted for all of this. And then in the second position, we have the mandatory due diligence, so the approach that is proposed by the European Commission. And very interestingly, I think the import ban, so import restrictions, are only got 5% of votes. So I would like to ask to each of you, really in a nutshell, are you surprised by the fact that the trade-based approach, so the import ban, is not very much liked by our audience and by people who followed us? I would start with Ulrika, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the interesting results from the polls. No, I would say I'm not very surprised. I would say that the dialogue is the other side of the coin, so to speak. So in order to have a dialogue with third countries, you would reach the results and get some improvements and development in a better way, a more effective way than impose a ban.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. I now ask the same question to Claudia. Are you surprised?
No, because trade bans, for those who follow the discussion a little bit, it's clear that trade bans are only one small aspect. Trade bans could help complement or implement due diligence law, but they always carry the risk of leaving the workers behind. Like, who is cut off? Who is actually losing in the trade bans? It will be the workers in the supplying countries.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Laurent, what is your opinion about this?
I also believe trade ban should be a last resort solution. If they're effective in the spirit of what we're trying to achieve, which is improving, the conditions of the environment and workers, I think before imposing a trade ban, the European Union should make sure that it has sufficient leverage and that the company will enact, like we heard through Phil Bloomer in Malaysia on the rubber gloves, that it actually had created a change on the ground. Because if we're only representing, 5-10% of that particular trade flow, then nothing's going to happen, unfortunately.
Thank you. And Berlange, I mean, this proposal was also was an amendment to your report, which proposed import restrictions in very extreme cases. So are you surprised by the fact that there is very little support for these kind of measures?
Not at all, because it's really irrational to just focus on import bans, because that will be not improve the situation, and who is suffering for such an import ban? These are the employees, the people on the ground in the partner countries. So this is not an adequate instrument, and by the way, it is used by the United States also as a political instrument. So now the first option is the best way, and the second, of course, we have to integrate the cooperation with third countries. For example, we have now started the cocoa initiative with Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. So we have to bring partner countries in a form of dialogue on board as an additional element of due diligence.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can ask again to Phil if he wants to give us a comment on our poll.
Yes, thanks very much. I just wanted to highlight one thing on the poll. It's not that the import ban is not popular. You can see 42% of the people want all three. So what we're seeing is that it's a very intelligent poll. I think you've got a very intelligent audience because you've got the least preferred option is the import ban for all the reasons we've heard from Bernd and Laurent and Claudia. But the overall sense is that an import ban is an important part of the arsenal that's necessary. And I think that trade and investment agreements, particularly when they apply to the most egregious forms of abuse, such as forced labour, child labour, can be a really important adjunct to the European Union's approach.
Thank you very much, Phil, for making that clear. Yes, indeed, the import ban is part of all of this answer. So yeah, people who who voted for a comprehensive approach also had that in mind. But maybe it's interesting to see that when we had, for example, discussion when the new commissioner for trade, Valdis Dombrovskis, had an hearing with MEPs, several questions were focused really on this issue of forced labor. And the Commissioner Dombrovskis insisted very much on the fact that this upcoming instrument, this due diligence on supply chains corporate responsibility mechanism, would be the answer to this kind of issues. So we really had the impression that a very much trade-focused approach could be in the works. Then, according to what Commissioner Renders told us, the approach seems to be a little bit different. So maybe there will be other instruments in the future. I would like to thank all of you for being with us and for the interesting conversation we had. Of course, there are many other elements, but I'm sure we'll have opportunity to discuss them again in the future. So just to wrap up our conversation, I think we had you highlighted all the strong points and maybe the one you're less convinced about in the commission proposal. You're all in favor of a comprehensive approach focused on due diligence rather than a narrow scoped trade approach. And there is this open question of liability and to the extent of this liability. So I would like to thank you, Bernd, Laurent, Ulrika, Claudia, and Phil for being with us today. And I would also like to thank our audience for following us and for sending this very interesting question. I, of course, would like to thank as well our partner, Bayer, for making this event possible. And please feel free to send us feedback at events@politico.eu. There are on the schedule many others online events for the following months. And we hope to see you soon in person very, very soon. And take care. Thank you very much. Bye.